I'm Dr. McCobb. I'm from Shelter and Community Medicine and the Assistant Director of the Center for Animals and Public Policy. We want to welcome you today to this webinar. We're really excited to have Dr. Roger Haston presenting today. I got the opportunity to hear him give a similar presentation to the New England Federation of Humane Societies earlier this year. And I just thought it would be really relevant to our audience and supporters. So I'm really excited that he agreed to kind of give it to this audience. Dr. Haston is a recognized world leader in animal welfare through his research and public speaking. He served on the boards of the Humane Society of Boulder Valley, Colorado Pet Overpopulation Fund, Pet Aid Colorado, Catalyst Council, Emancipet, Animal Grant Makers, the National Council on Pet Population and Policy, Arizona Alliance for Nonprofits, and Shelter Animals Count. He has a PhD in geophysics from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an MBA in finance from Rice University. He originally worked in the oil and gas industry in Texas, but since moving to Colorado, and then moved to Colorado in 1998, where he started and grew Axis Geophysics, a successful business in geophysical data processing, which served the oil and gas industry. But since 2012, he's committed himself full-time to animal welfare, where he's worked at the Animal Assistance Foundation, PetSmart Charities, and currently he started the Institute for Animals, which focuses on strategy, research, advocacy, insight, and thought leadership. So thrilled to welcome him to our webinar today, and thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy presenting to you guys, and this is some work that was really, the question was asked around, what's happening with dogs in the US, and not just in the shelters. This was about what's really going on in the communities as well, and where are we and where are we headed. So it was a challenging piece of work because we first had to establish kind of where we are and then start to think about where we're headed in the future. Oops. And if I can get this to advance, there we go. I think I always like to talk about data, and data has been fundamental to the work that I've done throughout my career. And there are really two approaches when you have complex data sets. And when we start talking about dog population in the US, they are very complex. One is to do direct measurements, and one is to do model-based estimation. Direct measurements are really good when you have a fairly highly specific topic, an imaginable scope, and a high degree of accuracy in what you measure. But a lot of times in the work that we do, especially with shelter data and community-based data, we don't have very good measurements, and the accuracy of those measurements are really bad, and the scope is so big that we have to use model-based techniques. And that's what I'll talk a lot about today, is some of those model-based techniques. And I like to use the analogy that when you have a lot of different data sources and complex data, it's like trying to have 32 different artists make a representation of the Mona Lisa, where each one just paints a small picture. And what you get back is distinctly not the Mona Lisa, but what you do find is that it's a representation that would allow you to start to think about what the Mona Lisa would actually look like, even if you had never seen that. So there will be a tremendous number of assumptions. And I hear people say all the time, well, the data is just the data. But quite literally, the second you start to load data, you start making interpretations. And I'll try to talk a lot about some of those interpretations that get made. Here, I got to move myself out of the way here. Come down. Some of the tenets that I used in this modeling was to integrate human demographic data, pet ownership data, and shelter data all in a way to start to paint a picture of what's happening in the country. I used a county level of aggregation, so I tried to make estimations for every single county in the country. And I used a lot of inferential techniques to estimate the dog populations, both in the shelters and, come back. One of the things I really wanted to do was have it centered around what I call controllable factors related to animal welfare activities. And those key assumptions that underlie so much of what the results produce here are that spay and neuter will reduce stray and unwanted pets over time. Technologies like microchips will improve RTO rates over time, that if we promote adoptions, that those will increase over time, and that our intervention programs out in the community will help reduce relinquishments over time. And then fundamentally, that increasing pet ownership in the community is a good thing for the community as a whole. And as I go through this, you'll see that those assumptions drive a lot of what we see in the model. And if we don't like what the model produces, then what we need to do is come back and ask questions about some of these core assumptions. So the first thing I had to do was try to predict how many dogs there actually are. And you can build a variety of ways to do that, but you have your current human population, how many current dog owning households there are, how many dogs die, how many were lost, how many get replaced, how many don't get replaced, how many new households are coming in, how many of those have dogs, and you do that all in one swell swoop, and you can come out with the total dog population. And there's a lot of different human population estimates out there, and I used a range, 3 different ranges, basically, low, medium, and high. The biggest driver of the differences between these models is how much immigration do we expect to happen over the next 3 years. But what we do know is the country is getting bigger, and it's going to continue to get bigger, really a lot driven by immigration into the country. And so there's a lot of different estimates out there around dog owning households, making those. And I use 3 different methods, all independently driven by different data, to see how consistent I could get. The AVMA data quotes about 48 million, APPA is about 57 million, Simon 45. And then I used 3 different methods. One was a state level ownership method, which took a lot of the AVMA data. One was a community size method, that there's some data out there on the size of community influences dog ownership rates, and then housing status, meaning owned or rented. And when I used those 3 different techniques, they were all within about 1% of each other, which made me feel pretty confident that I was getting a pretty good methodology for estimating how many dog owning households. I used the community size method, mostly because it was much easier to implement from a coding perspective than the others. And so it estimated about 49 million. There are about 49 million dog owning households in the country right now. And that's in line with a lot of the other estimates. And if we think about what's going to happen with those dog owning households over time, based off those population growth models, you can see here we are at, 48, 49 million. That's going to continue to grow in the middle case up to about 57 million dog owning households by 2050. So there's a pretty significant increase in dog owning households over time. But one of the things that we don't know that I wanted to run some iterations on is that really influences how many dogs do we think they're going to be in the community in the future, is really around ownership rates. And I ran the model across a variety, a family of ownership rates, with 0 being right now, I think it's about 40% of households have dogs, maybe a little less than that. And this shows if the percentage increase in ownership. So if it's at 40 today, in the high case, that would be at 44% in 2050. And then in the low case, it would be about 36%. And I ran the model a number of times over those scenarios to see what the variability and what the range of possible solutions are around that. And if we do that, and I look at the middle growth population growth case with those ownership, the dark line is the average. And you can see that we go from 79 million up to about 100 million by 2050. And the shaded area is the standard deviation around that, that reflects that potential variability in the ownership rates. But no matter what you look at, we're going to have a lot more dogs in this country in 2050 than we do now by a significant amount, about 20% more. And if we then also, to try to estimate what we're really trying to get at here, is what's the replacement rate? How many dogs are needed each year to replace and maintain that population right now? And there's quite a bit of, I had a lively discussion after my first talk about this number because it uses a lot of mortality data to try to estimate how many pets are dying each year, how many dogs are dying each year. And it sits somewhere between about 6 million and 7 million is about the estimated dog deaths, and that grows over time, not because dogs are dying more frequently, but just that we have a lot more dogs, but that's going to grow up close to almost 9 million by 2050. And then we get to how many replacements, and that's really a key when we start to think about the future and where people are going to get dogs. This becomes a very important number, and right now it's just over 7.5 million. That's going to grow up to just over 9 million, and this accounts for about, I estimated that about 95% of the people that lose a dog replace a dog, that there's about the same ownership rate for people coming into the country and all that. But you can see the need for dogs is growing. So that was kind of the demand side. There's going to be a lot more dogs, and there's a substantial number of dogs that need to be replaced. So now the question is, how many? What's the future shelter population, and what does that look like in comparison to the demand for dogs going forward? And there's a couple of things when I talk about shelter data that's really important, because it is some of the most complex and tricky data. And it's really important to understand what it's measuring and what it's not measuring. And what it is not measuring is it is not a direct measurement of what's happening in the community. And what's important in this study is I needed to know what was happening in the community. So I know that my shelter data is simply an inferential of what's going on in the community. And what it is a reflection of internal operations and policies around managing the flow. So depending on what internal things you decide how you run your shelter can really influence the data that you're getting from that shelter in terms of how well it represents what's going on in the community. And it's really just an indirect or inferential indication. So you have to really start to understand why and how to take that shelter data and start to project what it means out in the community. And so I'm going to take a small data science detour in the shelter data because there's some complications about it that I think are really important to start to think about. One is when you do a study like this, you always hope that you have good sampling. And I will say that the shelter data is terrible. We have every sampling error you could possibly imagine, both temporal, spatial, and we've got it. And so you have to come up with some ways to try to overcome that bad sampling. It is dominantly self-reported, so it suffers all the errors that you get with self-reported data. So you don't know necessarily that you have errors, so you got to figure that out. And the intake and outcome data are often geographically disassociated, meaning where an animal goes in is not necessarily where it goes out, especially nowadays where adoptions happen all over the place, whether it's in a retail store or a mobile van or whatever, or transferred to a whole nother state. And so trying to understand how you relate adoptions to how that community is doing is really quite tricky, because a lot of times those adoptions aren't where the animal came in. And then a shelter does not represent a point in space. It represents a sphere of influence. And the problem is we don't necessarily know the size and scope of that sphere of influence in a lot of places. And just as an example, this was when I was looking at puppy intake and the counties that had reported puppy intake. This is what I have. And so it looks really ugly and sparsely sampled, and you have to come up with some tricky techniques. The sphere of influence is really important to start to understand if we want to think about how to relate shelter data to what's actually going on in the community. And this is a case, and if we look at the East Coast compared to the West Coast, I can have San Bernardino County, which covers an immense huge area, and mostly if I have a shelter in San Bernardino County, it will represent San Bernardino County. But I could go to, say, Virginia, where my counties are very, very small, and I can have a major shelter that may get animals coming in from 6 or 8 different counties. And then you have a challenge of, especially if you're going to do attributes like per capita, how do you distribute that intake data across those counties that shelter may have influence? And I'll talk a little more about that. And you also get a lot of really bad intake policy distortions and sometimes just miscoding. And this is just an example from in Arizona. And I don't put this up there to as a criticism. It's just the way people record things and can really distort your data. And this is from Maricopa County, and you can see their recorded stray intake reference to 100% in 2016 is dropped by almost 50%. And their relinquishments have gone up almost double. It's just not likely that those numbers are reflecting what's going on in Maricopa County, that the stray population has dropped by over half in 3 years or 4 years. So there's something else going on here, and it's probably something to do with the way they're operating the shelter, not so much a reflection. And you have to try to identify those and overcome some of those errors as well. And then you get tremendous transfer distortions, both in double counting, and then also if you're trying to understand what the dog population is out in the community, you suffer from a lot of things, especially selection bias. And this is an example in South Dakota, and there's a organization up there called Turtle Mountain Animal Rescue, and they're right next to a big tribal lands, and they go and take a lot of the animals from there and then transfer them out. And predominantly what they're taking is puppies and younger animals that are much easier to adopt, which makes a lot of sense. But now when we look at that data, we have to question whether that's a valid representation of what's going on in the community, and you have to try to fix that. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the really complicated things about shelter data. And now I'm going to get back to how I went about trying to build continuous maps for estimating basically the community intake data, meaning strays, relinquishments, and seizures. So you end up, and I use mostly shelter animal count data and a few others. You got this very sparse grid. You aggregate it to the county level because you can have multiple organizations in one county. You can project that then and combine it with the demographic data like population, income, race and ethnicity designation, all those things, which I did, and then use a technique that I called random forest regression, which looks at a lot of, is kind of a unsupervised AI technique that can help you then build a model to predict based on all those attributes to come up with a continuous estimate in every county, and I'll show you in more detail. But that was the basic approach to try to fill in the data that I did not have. In this case, what I was trying to predict is community intake, which is all the animals that are just coming in from that community. So it strips out transfers because transfers distort and can cause double counting. The community intake was simply stray, relinquishment, and seizures and others like that. The number one predictor, unquestionably, for predicting how many animals are going to be coming into your shelter is population. It dominates. So the other ones that popped out in this particular case were latitude, income, percent Hispanic, percent renters, and percent African American, and then a lot of the ethnic designation ones tended to come up, and I like to put a bit of a caveat on that, in that it's the way the modeling works. I think it's far more of it's not because somebody is, say, Hispanic, it's because that there's an awful lot of social issues in and related to it. So it's a correlative, not a causal, but it does highlight that there's a very strong connection between some of the human issues and some of the animal issues that pop on the same variables. Oops, come back. Yeah. And so if we look at what the community intakes are across the country, and we look at it county by county, in areas like Phoenix, LA, a lot of the big cities, Miami, a lot in Texas, you can see the brighter colors are much bigger. A lot of that is just because they're high populations. And then we can also, if we want to try to calculate what the total number of homeless animals are left in the shelter after we get the lost ones back home, we can build a return to owner rate and map. And what you see is down in the South, in particular, and through Appalachia, very low RTO rates for when a stray comes in. Up in the Northeast, not surprisingly, very high in the West, Pacific Northwest, Colorado, and also through some of the Montana, Idaho. And I think that a lot of those are high because there's just not a lot of people there, and it's a lot easier to get animals back. But you can see it represents a pretty interesting view of where we're having the biggest problem getting animals back once they come in. But we can take that, and then we can calculate from that by taking the total number of community intakes and subtracting out the ones that went back through RTO process, and get what the total number looks like. And we get this map, and not surprisingly, you see all the kind of areas that you would expect. LA, Southern California, New Mexico, Texas, through the Appalachians, and through Florida is the highest number of total homeless dogs. So now what we want to do, that gives me the ability now, I kind of know how many we have, and I want to start to think about what that looks like going forward through time. And so I want to look at the temporal aspects of that as well. So this is just some data I pulled from North Carolina, from all the reported shelters there aggregated. And if I look at intakes shown here in green from 2012 to 2019, what you see is it's dropped tremendously from about 185,000 down to about 100,000. So almost in half, which is amazing. We can look at euthanasias. Same thing, we see this tremendous drop in euthanasias from almost 100,000 in 2012 down to just over 20,000 in 2019. That's phenomenal. But what's fascinating is if you look at total adoptions across that same time period, it's pretty flat. And the same goes with RTOs. They're pretty flat. And this is a pattern that you see all over the country, that you're seeing tremendous drop in intake, tremendous drop in euthanasias, but adoptions and RTOs are staying relatively flat. I think when you think about what does that actually mean, it means that the biggest change is happening in the community. And that change is probably most likely driven by all the spay and neuter efforts that are now bringing that total population down. So in any population model, you need to know kind of what the birth rate is out in the community to start to try to predict how quickly that decline will either drop or not drop based on the fecundity out in that community. And so I developed a ratio that I call the puppy intake ratio, and it's not very complicated. It is basically the number of reported juveniles coming into a shelter divided by the total number of dogs coming into the shelter. And the assumption is that the higher that ratio, the more puppies that you have coming in your total dog population would mean that you have a much higher birth rate out in the community than in areas where that puppy intake ratio is low. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because if you don't have a big overpopulation problem in your community, it's unlikely that people will just be bringing boxes of puppies into your shelter. And just to validate that, I looked at another metric, which was my per capita per capita puppy transport out of shelters to see who had an excess and was transferring them out. And what you see is, again, not surprisingly, New Mexico, all through like the Mississippi Valley, Appalachia, where you don't see hardly any being transferred out, would be in the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest, the Bay Area, a lot in Colorado. So it really gave me a lot of confidence that I had a pretty good representation of kind of what the birth rate was in these communities. And I use that with some fancy math to calculate kind of the initial intake decline rate in each of these counties. That was the start. And again, you see the usual suspects pop out, and what you see where the hotter the colors, the slower the initial decline, the colder the color, the faster the decline. You'll keep seeing that up here in North and South Dakota, the numbers are quite high and look a lot like the South. And I think a lot of that is driven by the fact that we have a lot of tribal lands out there, and we just have not done a very good job of helping in these tribal areas with some of the animal issues that they have. So I ran a number of scenarios and to see basically, depending on how fast we decline, what an impact it has. And each one of these lines represents a county in the country. In this case, in the kind of the most conservative case, I just kind of assumed everybody was going to be dropping at the same rate. And then I increased that the steeper your decline was now, the faster you were going to drop. And you start to get the spread where in these cases where things are happening very fast now, they drop off and then start to asymptote out. This is very common. These kind of power and exponential curves are very common in population modeling, where you'll see it either do that kind of exponential curve or it'll flatten out on the growth side, and it represents that logistics growth. So if we do that, I can estimate the total number of stray intakes over time. Right now we're about 1.5 million, and you can see that by 2050, we're going to be down to about 1.1 million. And again, this is the standard deviation around all those different scenarios that I ran, but it's going down, and it's going down pretty fast. And we can take that and then calculate the total number of community intakes and watch what happens over time. So I'm going to play a little scenario, and this is all referenced to where 0% today, and as those numbers go down, that means the decline. So the cooler the color, the more decline has happened. And you can see that in the Northeast, even though the numbers are already low, it's going to continue to get low of what's coming in from the community. And this is really being driven by the fact that those stray intakes are continuing to drop quite fast. You see that by 2050, very low numbers in the Pacific Northwest through Colorado, even in California and Arizona. And we still have quite a few issues to deal with in Appalachia and Mississippi Valley and Texas. But it's dropping very quickly because this is referenced to where we are today. And then the other one that we need to really know is the RTO rate if we want to understand how many homeless animals are in the shelter. This is each state and where they currently are. Some are very high, like almost 90% RTO rate. If a stray comes in, about 90% chance it's going out. And some are quite low, down in the 30% rate. But I assume that technology is improving, where our understanding and our focus on RTOs is improving, and that the lower the number is today, the faster that will improve. And this is that power curve that kind of comes up into where I think some states, I assume, would be around 70 or 80% RTO rate in the future, and to see what impact that has. And if we look at RTOs over time, right now we're about 700,000. That'll climb a bit, mostly because we're having more dogs. And then as that intake decline, that stray population continues to decline, you'll see RTOs start to go down. And then from all that, we can estimate the total number of homeless dogs. And the homeless dogs, again, is community intakes minus RTOs. Right now, we're just under 1.8 million. And you'll see some other studies will quote, you'll see 2.4, 2.5. I think that what has happened there is they have not taken the RTOs out. I do not consider an animal that is still within its stray period and has a chance to go back as that is not homeless, that's just lost at this point. This is truly homeless where they're left in the shelter. You'll see over time that drops pretty substantially to under 1.2 million from about 1.8. So we're doing what we said we wanted to do. We're really bringing that population of homeless dogs down. And like I mentioned earlier, and I showed you from North Carolina, what's fascinating was when you look at the absolute number of adoptions across almost every state, they're very flat. And this represents probably a third or maybe 40% of all adoptions reported, but you see it pretty consistently across the country. So you could interpret this two key ways. One would be that there's a really strong downward pressure on adoptions because we're getting fewer animals in, and we're doing a great job and managing to keep that downward decline flat. The other is that some of the things that we're doing to promote adoptions aren't working as well as we thought they were. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a very interesting one that I think we need to explore. But it's not surprising that as your intake declines, your total number of adoptions will start to decline as well with that. And I ran two cases for that, looking at adoptions over time. In green would be that there's no supply constraint, meaning I don't run out of shelter animals. And if that was true, our adoptions would probably grow up to about 1.6 million. But we know that that intake is going down, and that's what we have here in blue. And we're going to see a decline in adoptions by 2050 down to about 1 million. And that's definitely being driven by the fact that we just have way less animals now coming into the shelter. And if we then compare what the net supply of dogs coming into the shelter, that is, and what I really care about is that the homeless minus the adoptions gives me my net supply. I want that to be as low as possible. Here's in green is the homeless, and in blue is the adoptions, and in red is that net. And you can see right now it's about 500,000, and that's dropping, and it drops and gets to kind of a stasis point by about 2028. The big error here, why it didn't go to zero, is it depends on the assumption you make about what percentages of dogs coming into shelters just are not going to be adoptable for either be it medical or behavior reasons. But it will essentially reach a point of equilibrium by about 2028. So in summary, I went pretty fast too, so that we have lots of time for questions. That's good. The demand for dogs is going to continue to increase in this country, and it's mostly driven by population growth. There are some things that I think are causing a downward push on that, and that would be people's lifestyles, housing situations. There's a high percentage of people renting, and we know that renters have a lower ownership percentage, but there's also that growth, and I think the continued recognition that pets are important in people's lives will keep those ownership rates about where they are, if not a little bit higher. I think shelter intake is going to continue to decline, and especially if we keep doing what we're doing. And I say this in I think every talk is we can't stop spay and neutering. I mean, that is fundamental to where we've gotten. And although it feels like we're there, I think like any population, you have to continue those sterilization efforts, and we have to continue to improve RTOs. And under most assumptions, we basically will have solved, with big quotes around that, the main problem that we had set out to do, and that was there were more dogs coming into the shelter than we could get out. And that's not to say that there still won't be some euthanasias, and those are going to be for reasons other than overpopulation. And that I think the hard part is that adoptions will continue to decline as the intake begins to decline as well. And I think there's a lot of really important implications to this work, and I skipped over some big chunks of it, but that the impact of intake decline is going to make transports become such a big source of animals, especially in the Northeast, in Colorado, in the Pacific Northwest, that as we continue to make improvements, and especially in areas in like Mississippi and the Appalachia, Texas, the need to transport those animals is going to decline. And that's going to have profound implications for places like the Northeast. We're going to start to lose diversity of animals entering the shelter. There's just not going to be a lot of puppies that come in as we get better and better. And I think that's something very important, because we know that there is a strong desire for people want those kind of animals, and that diversity is just not going to be in the shelter anymore. And how we're going to deal with that is going to be complicated. And we can't lose focus on spay and neuter. I say that all the time. I mean, we got here because we did so much great work there. We don't want to let up. We may have to change how we do it a little bit, but we can't stop that. And just understanding why relinquishments aren't declining more. I mean, we've been putting a lot of effort in the last 5 years around relinquishment prevention, but we're not seeing that show up in the data yet. And I'm not sure why, but I think that's something we really need to start to understand, because it's so deeply integrated into some of the human issues as well, that we need to become better sociologists to really understand why what we're doing right now is not having the expected impact. And fundamentally, where people are going to get their pets is challenging, because that gap, if you think about that replacement rate at 7 million or so right now, and the shelter's only providing about 1.8 million, and that gap's going to grow over time. There's going to be, by 2050, 7 or 8 million dogs that are acquired not from a shelter. And the question is, what is our role? What is the role of animal welfare minded organizations in pet acquisition? How are we going to deal with that gap? And what should our role be? And what are the ethical concerns and issues that we're going to have to tackle going forward? And then finally, because metrics are so important to me, how do we measure success going forward? Most of our measurements, and I've talked about this in some of my other talks, most of our measurements are very internally focused to sheltering. But that's not what we're really talking about now going forward. We have to come up with better ways to start to measure how these programs are working out in the community. And so we know whether we're making progress or not. And when we think about some of the access to care issues that have become so forefront now, it's going to be even more important that we have good techniques for starting to measure how community is doing, not just how a particular shelter is doing in that community. All right, so I blasted through that really fast because I wanted to leave some time for questions. And I know that was a lot to digest, and I skipped over some big chunks of technique and all that, but I will stop, and then we'll open it up for questions, and hopefully we can keep that going here for another 15, 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haston. We do have a number of questions going. So let's see. First one being, could you share your opinions on the adopt, don't shop movement?
I think it's going to be challenging. I think we have to be realistic that and it goes back to my assumptions. I do believe, and there's a lot of science now to support the fact that pets make our lives better. And I don't think we want to stop promoting people having pets in their houses. But that gap is big, and I think it's about I think we need to reframe that a little bit to start to talk about making sure that any animal comes from a humane place, be it the shelter or if somebody gets it from a breeder. And if we don't, then I think we suffer a couple bad consequences. Is we get left behind, and we start to have to tell people you can't have an animal. And we've spent so much time trying to show people how great it is to have an animal. I don't think we want to stop that. So I think it's going to cause us to have some really uncomfortable conversations. I think we always want to do, still a tremendous amount of work to be done to help shelter animals, and there always will be. That's not going away. But I think we just need to change our focus and expand it to really think about dog acquisition in a much broader perspective that really promotes the fact that our society is a better place with more dogs. And I'm a total dog person, so I'll stand by that.
Excellent, thank you. Another question, are you going to repeat your analysis taking the COVID-19 pandemic into account?
Yeah, boy, everybody asked me that question. It's a great question. I don't have the data yet. I would like to. It would be very fascinating, I think, to see what COVID has done. Some of the data, it does seem like adoptions are up, which is great. And I think it may highlight some real opportunities for us to change maybe the way that we've done things in the past, that it's opened up some lower cost ways to do sheltering. And then also, I think it's really forced us to have to deal with the community a lot more. I'll be anxious to see what it looks like. I don't know the answer to that yet, but people keep asking me to do that. So hopefully in a year, I'll get that done.
Well, thank you. Let's see, someone noticed Hawaii is not represented in the data. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, I left out Hawaii and Alaska because they brought, it didn't substantially change the overall picture, and we were just looking at continental, and it added some complexity and the data quality was tough to incorporate it. I could, but I didn't. So I just did lower 48.
Okay. There's a number of questions that are sounding similar. So let's see. This one is, are you concerned that the demand for dogs will be met by breeders since spay and neuter efforts are expanding? And let's see, how do you think the reduced population of dogs available in shelters will impact the demand for purebred dogs? I feel like those are pretty similar questions.
Yeah, it's going to be challenging. And I mean, when I've done a lot of business consulting, I would always talk with companies. And the one thing I said is, and usually they didn't call me until things were bad. And when things are really bad, I describe the problem as hard. But it's not overly complicated. If your company is going down the tubes, you don't have a lot of choices of what to do. You just got to fix it. And it's hard work, but it's not overly complicated because you don't have the ability to have a lot of choices. Now that we've been successful, and success is always the way more complex planning thing, because you have now way more opportunity available to you. And I think that's where we are in the animal welfare world. Is we accomplished a lot of what we set out to do. Not that there isn't more work to do, but now the question is, what do we want to do next? And how are we going to start to expand our conversation that allows us to incorporate the broader world of dog acquisition? It's going to happen. The question is, what role are we going to play in it? And I think we need to be in some uncomfortable conversations, but if we're not there, then I worry that our ability to drive humane treatment of animals will be compromised. We need to influence legislation about what's appropriate breeding. I mean, you see this in Canada already, where there's, because they've run out of dogs in places, where they're having to start to roll out programs to educate the community. And I think one of the biggest roles we have is to educate the community about the importance of making sure wherever you got your animal that it came from a humane source, because that's at least with that we can feel comfortable that animals aren't being mistreated, they're not being raised in bad situations. But if we don't embrace the challenge of that question, then the problem is it's going to happen anyway. And I think we need our voice, and a strong voice in that conversation, not walk away from it, even though it's uncomfortable and hard.
I see a number of questions coming in about cats. Are there is there similar information about cats?
This was specifically dogs. Cats are, I would like to do the cat one. It is even harder than the dog one, because nowadays the shelter data is not really a reflection of the community issues with cats, if that's what we're thinking about. It's more a reflection of internal policies, because in most places now, and I support this greatly and funded much of it, is we're not using the shelters. They're not coming into shelters anymore. So how do we go about trying to understand that? There's a great project going on in Washington, D.C. called DC Cat Count, which I think is kind of, that will extend into a study like this probably, where they're really trying to understand the role and number of cats in a big metropolitan area like DC. But it's a challenging one. Maybe next year I'll get to that.
Let's see. I see a number of questions about outside of the US. If you know if there's similar studies or to this in other countries, Canada, somebody suggested also Puerto Rico, counting Puerto Rico in the US.
Yeah, Puerto Rico would be fascinating. Data's not great there right now for a variety of reasons. They got smashed by a hurricane and left behind, but there's been some studies out of Brazil, and I use some techniques. There's actually some really interesting research going on in Brazil, where they did a dog population model, a similar technique that I use, slightly different, to try to understand what was going on in the community and really look at kind of the breeding rate. There's been a few in India, and a little bit in Canada, but I don't think quite as comprehensive as this one was. But it would be worthwhile doing.
Let's see. We have found in our breed rescue that lower intakes are also caused by the wide use of social media. People with adoptable dogs to rehome use that instead of turning to rescue. Mm-hmm. This may be a factor in shelter intakes as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think there is a lot of now outside the shelter work going on that wasn't before, and it's hard to know because we don't have good data on that. So I think when you see, when I'm thinking about that North Carolina data, I think that influence is really affecting, and I think it's why shelters have been able to get it under control, is that there are more avenues now than just the brick and mortar shelter. It's just really hard to get data on that. We can kind of see a little bit from adoption data, but if it's going off via social media and it never gets recorded anywhere in any of our current data sources, then it's very hard to see, and we just have to guess at it. I would like to start to see more requirements for that data being recorded, because I think it would really help us understand just the importance of that role as it's developed over, especially through COVID. I think you're going to see that the ability to start to attenuate the need for so much brick and mortar sheltering is some of the cool technology and all that's being worked on is helping with that. It's just really hard to get that data.
Makes sense. How will expected impacts of climate change, such as increases in disaster, human inequity, human migration, etc., how might that influence these models?
Wow. These are hard questions.
We're getting a lot of questions too.
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest. I think it, when we think about increased disasters, what comes to mind for me there really is we have to get better trained at how to deal with all the animals involved, and we have. When we think back to Katrina and where we are now and how a lot of policies have changed, and I think it gets to not trying everything we can not to break a bond if that bond exists, whether it's a hurricane, an earthquake, whatever. But we need to become good disaster planners and make sure that that has animals in it. But other than that, I don't know. Not sure on how that'll affect migration as well, but that's a great question.
Thank you. Good answer. Let's see. You estimate that there are about 80 million dogs in the USA right now, of which 1.5 million are homeless. How confident are you in these numbers?
It was about 1.8 homeless. I think 1.55 was stray. I feel pretty good about them. There's obviously, for the astute observer, you can see if you look at those maps really closely, some data busts, and you have to make a lot of assumptions. But you know, I don't think it's wildly off. I think it's pretty close. It's certainly close enough that it gives you an idea of where we're at, much when we think about that Picasso picture. So it could be, maybe it could be as high as 2 million, maybe it could be as low as 1.6. It's not 4. So I feel pretty good with the numbers, especially in total homeless. But again, you know, it's a complex thing, and there's a lot of assumptions you have to make. But when I've looked at other people's work, generally we're not wildly off, other than a few examples, but most people are kind of coming into that range of estimate.
Besides shelter routes, what about dog and cat supply numbers and trends from show and field trial breeders, retail, hobby breeders, pet stores, and other commercial suppliers? And what about so-called suspect foreign rescue sources? How much adoption traffic occurs within breed organizations?
Let's see. So I can only infer the total number of dog acquisitions that aren't sheltered. Exactly where they came from, I don't know. I think that's some work that I would like to do, is really start to understand where, to break that down into more specific bits as to whether they're small breeders, whether they're puppy mills, what do those sources actually look like. I haven't looked at that yet. The international transfer is growing. As the demand is there will certainly be a large incentive to bring animals in from Mexico, from South Korea, from Eastern Europe, which is already happening now. There's a lot of issues around that that are beyond the scope of this particular talk, but that will be something that will generate a set of issues in and of itself, be it disease, the ethical nature of what you're doing and all that. But I think in pet stores, you know, certainly a lot of the major brands now for dogs purely adopt. I'm not sure what the implication will be for them in the long run as that supply goes down. But there's going to be challenging issues across all of that, I guess, would be the answer. And we have to prepare.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll have some to answer by email. What data do you have on age of dogs and population over time?
So that one is, there hasn't surprisingly been a great study on dog age demographics. There's a couple studies that look at dog age of people going to the veterinarian. That is kind of a proxy for what the overall population might be. It's overweighted toward young dogs. So I'd say there's 2 or 3 studies. I used those and tried to correct for the bias toward puppies to build the mortality curve. But there isn't, as far as I can find, I haven't found a great study on dog age demographics in the community as a whole. And that I had a very lively debate with a couple people over the mortality curves and where it should be. And it is surprisingly sensitive to the total replacement rate is surprisingly sensitive to what assumptions you make around what that age distribution looks like in the community.
Okay. So let's see, we do have a number of questions we'll get to by email, and I just want to let everyone know that there are a lot of good questions here. So I will be sharing the questions and answers with everyone who registered. So they'll get to see. I'm sure other people are interested. There's a lot of similar questions though. Do you have anything you'd like to wrap up with?
Just thank you guys for letting me talk to you. The goal around modeling, and I always like to tell people that, is modeling is not the answer. Modeling is the start of asking a lot of questions. And I think because of the difficultness of the data, the power of modeling now allows us to ask more specific questions around studies that maybe we need to do, data we need to collect, that then we can come back and update the model. And that was the goal, was to make this so that we can build it over time. And that's what I would really want you guys to walk away with this from, is this. I'm not telling you what the answer is, but I'm hoping this will allow us to frame far more specific questions about the things that we need to work on going forward. So, and feel free to ping me, and even if it's that I did something wrong, it's happened before, don't hesitate. It's that conversation that modeling allows us to then start to have it in a way that's far more rigorous and scientific, and allows us to move forward and understand these very tricky issues. So thank you guys very much for having me speak.
Thank you so much for your time and for the presentation. I think the robust number of questions, it just kind of sparks, you know, how fascinating this conversation is, and, you know, how much we really want these answers. So there's plenty of work for the researchers among us. So yeah. Thank you so much. That was really, really great.
You're welcome. Thank you guys.